we good? Hello and welcome to 2FA, so strong it could be 1FA, integrating WebAuthn for phishing-resistant authentication. And our speaker today is Greg Stromire. And Greg is an application security engineer for Gemini, where he works to shift security as far left as possible. He's going to tell us what that means. Okay, good. When he's not developing features to enhance the security of Gemini's main products, he's performing security assessments, building developer tools, and creating secure coding curriculum. We're going to have time for questions at the end. And if you want to ask a question, please use the microphone because it's a big room so everyone can hear. And would you please give a very warm welcome to Greg.
Thanks very much. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed that scramble to get the displays working correctly. So yeah, 2FA, so strong it could be 1FA. It's the promise of WebAuthn. I wanted to start out with introducing myself. So I'm Greg. Excited to be here. I'm an application security engineer at Gemini. Previously, I worked at a local startup doing privacy and security called WebAuthn. Not sure if anyone's heard. And I'm coming to application security from the developer perspective. I'm a software engineer by trade, but just got super into security. And I think there's ways that we can make it really great for the developers and for security engineers and for the users. So has anyone heard of Gemini? Yes, cool. We're hiring, come work for us. Okay. So yeah, Gemini is a licensed digital asset exchange and custodian founded by Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss. A couple more points that are pretty important, but I'm going to try and squeeze a lot of content in, so I'm just going to keep moving. So yeah, I try and shift left as far as possible. So traditionally, shift left means moving the security and capturing vulnerabilities before they make it to prod as soon as possible. So kind of thinking about watching for vulnerabilities and sort of anomaly monitoring, watching the build pipeline, and keep shifting left until we get to threat modeling. So in the design phase, or creating security features where no insecure code hits production. So one of my latest projects was WebAuthn. Another project I've done is like a compiler plugin so that developers don't even get a clean compile if they are using sort of an insecure method or framework or something. So I love to talk about this stuff. Seriously, come chat me up. So WebAuthn is pretty awesome, and it's a pretty new standard. So I'm going to kind of run through what it is, what problems it addresses, how we integrated it at Gemini. Hopefully I can work out demonstrations if I can figure out display issues. And then some sort of important considerations. Since this is a new sort of standard, there's still a lot to be learned from it. And then definitely take questions. So this is one of my favorite quotes about the technology. WebAuthn is a unicorn because it decreases user friction and increases security. A lot of times, us in the security engineering kind of see convenience and security as like mutually exclusive, but WebAuthn is a great counterexample. I imagine people have some idea what WebAuthn, but has anyone used it before as like a consumer? That's awesome. How about anyone ever implemented it for their own code or production or hobby or something? Nice. So WebAuthn is a W3C recommendation standard that was published in March of this year. So it specifically defines an API for strong, attested, scoped, and public key-based credentials for web applications so that users can strongly authenticate. So it's kind of weird to think about a new specification talking about authenticating users, surely we've gotten it right by now, but there's really just a lot of the same issues we keep having over and over. So the biggest issue is users need to authenticate to services securely. And typically, the three sort of approaches for this are to claim who you are by something you know, something you are, or something that you have. And I know this is a pretty old premise here, but I think bringing it up in light of new technology kind of gives us some interesting perspectives. So we use this everywhere. Everyone has passwords. We have probably too many to count, and hopefully everyone has a password manager. So a lot of the something that you are or the something that you have, they haven't really caught on. There's a little bit of more adoption, I'd say, recently with things like Touch ID or Windows Hello, but a lot of the issues that we're having with it sort of historically were things like just not user-friendly, or things like batteries would die, or screens would crack, or there'd be multiple keys per individual service that you'd have to keep track of. So password authentication, everyone's pretty familiar. It's about something you know. And where can this go wrong? Well, it can go wrong in countless ways, and it often does. So we can think about passwords as being really easy or really available, at least for users, but they're really failing us as an authentication method. And really, they pretty much always have been. So where are the ways that passwords are failing us? It's something that you know, which means it's a shared secret, which has its own risks involved. There's poor generation, oftentimes by our own heads, which are infamously terrible at this. There's poor management of it. So there's, writing it down in books kind of gets laughed at, but often maybe better than reusing them, which is another huge issue. So we think about using passwords and authenticating and proving who we are, and passwords just aren't enough, but we still use them, so let's add something onto it. So we have first factor authentication with passwords. We have second factor with a number of different ways. So thinking about things that you have, things that you are, something that you know via something that you have, it can all get kind of tricky here. So one-time passwords, time-based OTPs, biometrics, security keys, cards, fobs, all these kind of fit in those little categories, and they really haven't shown up for us in the ways that we need them to. So something like SMS, two-factor auth, it's something that you know. So if you have the first factor, password authentication, it's also something that you have, kind of, because it's a cell phone that you don't necessarily always control, and it can get out of control pretty quickly. So there's a bunch of huge risks here that we all kind of just accept, and maybe there's a better way. So one of the handful of the problems that we're seeing here is many of them can just be phished, whether it's the OTPs or even like email links, often associated with phone numbers, which are pretty historically bad at being sources of identity. Phones can often be ported or SIM swapped, and what's even the difference between those? And many of these are used for account recovery. So if you have SMS as your fallback mechanism to getting back into your Gmail, then that's your lowest bar for security, and it's potentially a huge risk. And we've heard that some of our users at Gemini are going through the extra steps of getting into contact with their telco providers and saying, hey, I want extra security on my account, give me a PIN. And then it turns out that some of the people providing customer service just want to make customers so happy that they'll bypass other accounts' security measures just so that they can be better suited better helping those customers. So it's a tricky spot that we're in here, and it has huge impacts. So I've got a couple headlines from the crypto industry, but obviously they're primarily targeted, but we're all sort of at risk in the same ways. This guy had a great moment where he fell victim to an attack. He knew he should have known better. I think he was an engineer, and he publicized it to help people kind of raise awareness. So my talk is about 2FA so strong it could be first factor authentication. So I've got a list of things, but I do want to revisit it later. And the primary thing that I think is really great about it is phishing resistance. So all the problems that we have with phishing with SMS and other features, it addresses those. But it also goes farther with replay prevention, man-in-the-middle defense, database breach. It's agnostic to those, where if there's a database breach of your WebAuthn credentials, it's actually just your public key, so it doesn't matter about anything. And then additional features where silent tracking or covert login prevention is really handy for devices that are capable. And a lot of these authenticators, these devices, are integrated with trusted platform modules or other secure enclaves where they're not really going to get cloned or be severely at risk for it. So WebAuthn is part of FIDO2. It's a bigger standard. It's kind of the overall umbrella standard. And it's about something that you have and potentially something that you are. So something that you have is something like a USB security key, like a YubiKey. Something that you are could be the touch bar using your fingerprint. That could also act as a WebAuthn authenticator. So if you look at the authenticators and then the client and then the relying party, these are some of the terms that are kind of being used for this standard. And we see that WebAuthn is kind of the interface around the client, some with the relying party, and then something called CTAP2, which is Client to Authenticator Protocol, the second version of it. And this is great, and it's got a lot of security properties to it, but it also kind of looks familiar for people that have kind of been in the space for a while. So the WebAuthn sort of part of it is really kind of a JavaScript API. So it allows people to create and use those public key credentials. But the familiar part of it is we've kind of seen this before with U2F. And in fact, this standard takes U2F, renames it to CTAP1, and it's also backwards compatible. So it's a great way to not leave users behind who have really put in the effort to have their U2F as a protection mechanism, and it gets to bring them forward into this newer protocol. The additional features that WebAuthn brings is a requirement for user presence. So this kind of goes back to a previous slide where it was talking about sort of covert login, where that's really not going to happen with WebAuthn. It requires some kind of gesture, whether it's a tap of a YubiKey or touching of a touch bar. So I'm going to talk about how we at Gemini integrated it with our platform. So we have been requiring 2FA for our users since pretty much the beginning. So it's really important for us to have a secure exchange, and I think our users are pretty grateful for that. So we got started before the spec was even standardized. In fact, we weren't even sure when it was going to happen. It was just like, we better get this out there. We want to see it working. Doesn't matter if it's sort of experimental. We'll take that. We weren't sure what the user adoption would be either, especially considering browser adoption or browser support could really go either way. So I'm just going to give a quick few slides or screenshots of what it looks like on our platform. So just adding a security key. You go to our security settings page and you give it a little nickname, so you can sort of add a bunch of authenticators and you can tell them apart, and it's kind of a little bit of user interface to it. And then some of the UI is already built into the browsers. So this is a screenshot of Chrome showing the authenticators that are available for my laptop. So it recognized that I have a USB security key plugged in. It recognized that I have a Mac with a touch bar that can also act like it. And so that's a nice thing for engineers, for the developers who kind of worry about creating a UI that's going to maybe look different from the UI of another site and really want to get users comfortable with it. With the browsers kind of taking on the responsibility, it makes everyone kind of like move forward a lot faster. So some more screens. The left is actually using a security key, and the right screen is actually using the touch bar. So another level of some nice UI, and you get to sort of have fallbacks as well. So you can kind of see the use password or the choose another option there. And so when we took this on, a big part of what we were thinking about is if users kind of opt into these security keys and then sort of have that as their only way to get into their account, and then they lose it, then we kind of force them into an account recovery thing, which can be really cumbersome, and they're going to think twice about trying to up their security. So we have a rule where you can't sort of disable our original Authy second factor method unless you register 2 keys. And that gives you your standard key and then maybe a fallback that you keep in a safety deposit box or something. So I was going to try and demo. I'll see. You guys just see that. I'm not going to, well, maybe. No, never mind. I'm not going to be able to like see both things. So, oh dear. Yeah, stuff. Oh, would it? Yeah. Let's see if I have time for this. Apologies to the people over there. All right, so this is our site. This is just me running the application locally. Let's see if I can just look over this podium here. Does that say 3? Super secret password. Super secret 2FA code. And then we're into this site. So this is what it looks like now. You go up to the security settings for your own account, and then there's a add security key. And I kind of showed slides from this, but I think what might happen is if I push this and then some of those like UI browser things might actually just show up on my laptop, but here's hoping. All right. So I'm going to use my YubiKey that's plugged in, and I can just tap it right there, and then it's asking to confirm it. And so there's the same sort of interface there. And now there's a security key, it's integrated, and it shows a login as well. So I'm going to do this again with my touch bar. And I'm going to select touch bar. And there's actually a little prompt on here that you can't see, but you have to believe me now. And then I verify it in the same way. And now I have 2 security keys enrolled, and I can actually disable, Authy if I wanted to. So I think that's pretty cool. It's pretty nice and easy. It's pretty well integrated with Chrome. And I think that brings a lot of security where some of the more traditional methods aren't really there. I can stop now for questions if there's any, or I can just keep going. Another cool thing is you can demo this at home as well. There's a handful of sites. Thanks. There's a handful of sites that sort of walk you through the process, and it's really cool to just try it out on your own and figure out which browsers are working, which devices you have available. Some of the older YubiKeys, maybe they don't work. It's pretty interesting. So I'm diving into the API right now. I'm going to show some JSON blobs, but I think there's some pretty interesting things to pull out here. So I've got Jon Snow at the wall, and he authenticated for our website. It's on localhost right now, which is fine. But some of these payloads are going to be useful for us when they get signed and then returned back to us. Especially the challenge, which is going to sort of prevent the replay attacks that we mentioned earlier. So yeah, going back real quick, the navigator.credentials.create, that's a JavaScript API that's in a browser right now, and you could try it out. So this is just continuing on with that blob, that request, the initial request for registration. And you can see that there's some public key params, which are about showing the algorithms that are available. So I think -7 is the P256 curve doing ECDSA, and then the -257 is RSA. So there's some other stuff. The requires resident key is a pretty interesting component to this, where you can require the key that you generate for WebAuthn for this particular service to be stored directly on the device that you're using. Sometimes with Touch ID or with some of the YubiKeys, what's actually happening is like a key wrapping where they have their own internal key, but then they encrypt the private key for a newly generated one, which is great because it allows them to not sort of run out of space for additional services. So you can use the same key for all of your accounts if everyone just decided to use it. But because you can specifically require a resident key, then that gives you an ability to say, I have this expectation of the devices being used, and I know that the key never left the platform. Did you have a question?
Yes, if you don't require a resident key, can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so it's basically what you saw just now. Both the Touch ID and the security key, they don't require resident key. It's just a matter of like key wrapping, where the private key gets encrypted with sort of like a single key that's sort of being reused for different services. So it's not sort of a loss of security in some ways. It's more about the sort of properties of the authenticator itself. So there's some attestation. That's another feature to this protocol. It has some properties to it that I'm not going to include here, but it's a pretty wide open protocol that has a lot of features to it. So, and then the response that you get back includes sort of this type, this ID, and then the client data JSON is some of the data that's being sort of packaged up and returned to you to show that, like, yes, this was something that we created. In fact, it's just base64 encoded, and you can sort of dive into it. And it shows sort of the original challenge, the origin, and it helps prevent those phishing attacks and those man-in-the-middle attacks as well. So the counterpart to it is once you've registered a credential or authenticator, then you use the navigator.credentials.get to sort of perform an authentication or authorization. So it's a lot of the similar properties here. In fact, it's pretty symmetrical between the two API. Just looking for something that's kind of unique to it. There's definitely the signature over the client data that is part of the signing of the action being done. And then again, it's just sort of client data, base64 encoded. There's some pretty interesting design decisions made around this protocol where some of it is base64 encoded, some of it's still raw binary, some of it's in like an old cozy format, and knowing how to parse those or get the right data out can kind of be troublesome. So again, back to 2FA, so strong it could be 1FA. I showed some of the initial promises, and now I'm kind of going back on like how it's delivering on those. So the phishing resistance is with that origin. The browser is going to check that, and the authenticators are going to sign over it, so there's no way to sort of intercept it and stand up a fake site that's going to be able to sort of pass along a fake authentication. It's just not going to work. So replay prevention with the challenge that's in there. There's man-in-the-middle defense because this protocol actually requires HTTPS as well as that origin check. It's agnostic to database breaches, again, because it's just public key crypto. Only the public keys are ever being stored. It prevents the silent tracking because of that user presence. So again, it requires some kind of gesture. And that could be the Touch ID, the tapping of a YubiKey. Sometimes it could be like a Bluetooth interaction there. And then it detects authenticator cloning, or at least gives you some heads up by keeping a signature counter. So if for some reason you were keeping track and I signed into Gemini, 10 times with this authenticator, and then somehow it showed up that my next one claimed it only signed up for 9, then at some point it's a pretty big indicator that there's an attempt to clone this authenticator. So it's a great additional step for understanding security and being knowledgeable and being able to make informed decisions. So 2FA is so strong, it could be 1FA because of the security properties like user presence, because of the idea of resident keys, because you can take it even from passwordless to usernameless, because you can think of those resident keys also keeping track of the actual user identity. So that you kind of skip a step, sort of requesting like, oh, who am I signing for here? It's already gonna have that. So some quick hints and suggestions and recommendations around integrating WebAuthn yourself. Definitely some things to keep in mind. The account recovery story. The account recovery story around a lost email or getting a new phone. It's pretty different to I dropped my YubiKey in a sewer grate or something. Like, it's not really strong, real simple ways to sort of recover from that. So having those backups can be really helpful. Also, it's still pretty new in the standardization. There's still some device and browser support that needs to catch up. I think we're at Chrome's doing great, Firefox is doing great. Safari is actually kind of running a little bit behind on this, which is too bad. And then there's the idea of platform versus roaming authenticators. And I've kind of been talking about it the whole time, but they actually kind of have names to it, where platform is something like a touch bar or Touch ID or Windows Hello, where it's integrated into the platform, typically with its own little secure enclave. And then roaming authenticators are basically you take them with you. They're security keys, they're access cards, things like that. And because they have different security properties, maybe you want each one in a different scenario. And it can be really helpful to know which is which, and you can actually, sort of decide which ones you're going to accept, which ones you're going to deny. Requiring backup keys is super important. There's also the ability to sort of go out and collect data from the authenticators themselves. So as a relying party or the service sort of integrating it right now, you can say, hey, I want to know more about this authenticator. Maybe does it have a strong attestation from its manufacturer? Does it just have some general model device numbers and information that I can sort of keep track of and understand? And then you have the ability to actually enforce attestations. So because this is such a new technology, then a lot of the manufacturers aren't sort of publishing it. So Yubico with their YubiKeys are kind of like leading the front lines on this because they can. They were part of the protocol proposal to begin with. So it's hard to sort of require that of the users when you might not even have many with supporting devices. But it could be something like in the long term we see get more adoption, and things like Android attestations are really getting more adoption as well. So there could be a lot of sort of cross device security stories there. And then there's some future work involved where there's potential to include prompts for individual transactions. So it's moving beyond just sort of logging in or accessing a particular site. It's, do you agree to this particular chunk of information? For us, it's super interesting because it's literally a transaction on our exchange, but you can imagine it in a lot of different ways. So again, account recovery is super important, making sure that there's backups, making sure that the recovery mechanism isn't diminishing your security itself. The browser and device support, we're only going to get better, but it's still a new technology. And then trying to have like some fallbacks in place or the ability to check. The platforming roaming identity authenticators I talked about before. At Gemini, we actually are pretty fortunate because we were already using YubiKeys as part of our infrastructure. So sort of requiring it for internal tooling was a pretty smooth transition. So it's actually made it simpler for some of the security mechanisms we put in place, because it's literally everyone has the same laptop, everyone has the same YubiKeys, and so everyone knows that they can just tap it and then move on. So then again, going back to collecting authenticator data, it's recommended to start collecting it from the very beginning, and that way you can start to build your trust models, start to figure out, are there certain patterns? Maybe you don't make any decisions on them right away. Maybe there's not a lot out there, but if you start collecting it initially, then you'll be more informed down the road. And then actually integrating it, it's super helpful to just get a head start by finding a library that already handles a lot of the heavy work. So there's Go, there's Java, there's Ruby, and then there's more on the way, I'm sure. So WebAuthn is that beautiful unicorn. Phishing resistance, replay prevention, man-in-the-middle defense, breach agnosticism, the covert login prevention, cloning detection, all strongly authenticating users. Any questions? Yes.
Would you mind going over once more what breach agnosticism is, please?
Yeah, basically, what I meant by that is if there's a database breach and a bunch of people's usernames and passwords are leaked online, then that's pretty unfortunate. Even if they're hashed, there can be some rainbow tables, and it's puts everyone in a tough spot. But if you're using WebAuthn